Now back to our top story, the first day of the new Parliament. To discuss the day's political events, as well as forecasts about the shape of the national economy, I was joined a short time ago from Canberra by the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey. Joe Hockey, thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure, Lee.
I'll come to matters in your portfolio in the second half of the interview, but if we can start with the events in the Parliament this afternoon and Peter Slipper becoming Deputy Speaker. So what happens now if the Speaker, Harry Jenkins, is absent during a contentious vote?
Well, it depends who's in the chair. It may be a member of the Speaker's panel, which is formed by the Labor Party, and one of those people may be sitting in the chair, in which case, if there is a tied vote, or it looks like there being a tied vote, they will vacate the chair and the Speaker will come into the House. As for the role of the Deputy Speaker, I would assume if there is a close vote, the Deputy Speaker would vacate the chair as well and hand to the Speaker. So
you can't imagine then a situation where there's a contentious vote where you end up with Peter Slipper in the chair costing you one vote?
No.
Peter Slipper got the job by 78 votes to 71. That means presumably he and only one other coalition-aligned member voted for him. Given that the overwhelming majority of coalition members clearly didn't prefer him in the job, are you angry that he helped vote himself into it?
Well, look, Lee, let's go back a step. In the last 2 weeks, the Labor Party has been reluctant to nominate their own person, Harry Jenkins, to be the Speaker. That's an extraordinary situation. They were not prepared to nominate one of their own, but they were dragged kicking and screaming to the table today. Secondly, Labor traditionally would have nominated the Deputy Speaker. They did nominate Deputy Speaker today, but they nominated a Liberal, which is an extraordinary humiliation for Anna Burke and a number of other people in the Labor Party who would normally have put up their hands to be the Deputy Speaker. Now, the Coalition has a Deputy Speaker and an Assistant Deputy Speaker, and it has the Speaker of their choice. So if somehow this is a great win for Labor, please convince me how, because I don't know how it is.
But that doesn't answer my question about whether the Coalition's unhappy that Peter Slipper got up for the job when he wasn't your preferred choice.
Well, our emotions on this don't really matter. What matters is the votes on the floor of the House.
Was it something that caused any discussion at the party room meeting tonight?
Oh, look, it has been discussed.
And what was the tone of the discussion?
Well, the tone of the discussion was Tony Abbott says, look, there are going to be from time to time events on the floor of the House that we do not control. And today was one of those events, but we're not the government. It's the government's responsibility to control the House of Representatives, not the opposition's. And quite frankly, if I were in the government, I wouldn't have been happy with today's proceedings.
But it sounds from what you've said like there might be a little bit of consternation there in your ranks towards Mr Slipper, given that he went along with Labor against the party's broader wishes.
Well, Peter Slipper has indicated that he is a vote for the Liberal and National parties. If there is to be a vote of no confidence or a vote against supply, he will side with the party that has helped him to be elected as the member for Fisher.
Do you think that the Coalition can rely on Mr Slipper's loyalty? Because presumably Labor thinks he's somewhat independent-minded, or they wouldn't have supported him for that job.
Well, I expect so. I expect he will be loyal to the parties that put him there, and he has indicated in public statements and in the House that he would be loyal to our party.
Obviously, Prime Ministers have demands on them that require them to be away from the Parliament. On what grounds would the opposition provide a pair for the Prime Minister?
Oh, well, on reasonable grounds.
And what would be reasonable grounds?
Look, well, we'll see them as events occur, obviously, when it's in the national interest. But Julia Gillard's first obligation is to serve the people of Australia. And Julia Gillard has cobbled together an alliance of interests on the floor of the House. She has an obligation to uphold that alliance.
What criteria would be used to make the determination of what occasions or meetings or events are in the national interest?
It would be the normal negotiation between the whips for the opposition and the whip for the government.
But I'm just wondering what would be the criteria, or is it just something that's going to be decided on any given day?
Yes, it will be, and it'll be part of a negotiated process. The obligation of a Member of Parliament is to be there in Parliament doing their job. It's not to be going and giving speeches in other jurisdictions that help their colleagues to be re-elected at a future date.
But she's not just any member of Parliament, it's the Prime Minister. Do you accept that the Prime Minister has different obligations than a regular backbencher?
Yes, but also the Prime Minister has an obligation to be there to vote. Now, if the Prime Minister is not there to vote, that's the call of the Labor Party. Let's be very clear. Going back to 1940, when there was the last hung Parliament, and I saw Heather Hewitt's piece on the 7:30 report saying this is unprecedented. Complete rubbish. There has been a hung Parliament before. The votes were 36 all between the Coalition and Labor. There were 2 independents. Now, the opposition leader at the time, John Curtin, did not give Robert Menzies a pair to go over and serve in a war cabinet. And he forced Robert Menzies not only to appoint a speaker, but also a deputy speaker from his own ranks. So, and secondly, John Curtin refused to be part of a united war cabinet in the same way that Britain had a united war cabinet, because his argument was an opposition has to serve as a robust opposition on the floor of the Parliament.
So what are you saying?
To have some sort of sanctimonious speech from the top of the hill from the Labor Party about unity and cohesiveness is just hypocritical, given what Labor Party did during the Second World War under John Curtin.
Well, actually, under John Curtin, he had a reputation of pursuing policies of cooperation with Menzies. He suggested that he proposed a war advisory council that Menzies agreed to set up, and then they worked together quite closely on that.
But it was not a united government. It was not a unity parliament as Robert Menzies demanded. And in the end, it became clear to Robert Menzies that it was incredibly difficult for him to serve as Prime Minister with a parliament that was so difficult to manage.
So let me give you the example. If the Prime Minister happens to be meeting with a visiting head of state, is that something for which you'd provide a pair?
I'm not going to go down the path of 100 different scenarios.
Well, I'm just wondering, how can the Prime Minister plan, or you know,
well,
how can you invite the Indonesian president to come over, and then he's sitting in your office, and all of a sudden you've got to nip off and leave him?
Lee, it doesn't occur like that. I mean, we've had the Indonesian president visit Australia during parliamentary sittings previously. There's a way to work through this. This is not unprecedented territory. State parliaments have had these sorts of arrangements in the past. But this is not the obligation of the opposition. It is the obligation of the government. Julia Gillard was elected to serve in government. She'd better get on with it.
Writing in The Punch today, the commentator David Pemberthy wrote that Tony Abbott's looking more like a campus Trotskyite than an alternative Prime Minister, as he employs a raft of tactics aimed at reducing Labor's tenuous majority, blocking its policy agenda and sabotaging the ability of the Prime Minister and senior ministers to do their jobs. Is that what's going on here?
No.
What is going on?
Emphatically no. Well, what's going on is the government, a minority government, that received fewer seats in the last election than the coalition, has cobbled together an alliance, and they're endeavouring to try and run the parliament. They're entitled to do that. But we're entitled to prosecute our policies and defend the people that voted for us.
Well, how do you intend to pick your fights?
Well, where there are policy disagreements, it'll be clear on the floor of the parliament.
But there always seem to be policy disagreements. I can't think of many issues where there aren't.
Well, no. Well, I mean, for example, the condolence motions in relation to Afghanistan diggers that died tonight clearly illustrated that both the government and the opposition support the war in Afghanistan, even though the Greens don't, and the Greens are bringing forward to the Parliament a motion to debate the ongoing war effort in Afghanistan.
Clearly Labor are going to keep calling you wreckers. Is there a risk that that will resonate with the public if the opposition does pick fights over comparatively minor courtesies like pairing?
No. No, this is just part of the Labor Party continuing with their election rhetoric.
You don't think there's any chance that might have any traction with the public?
No, I don't think so, because ultimately you have to look at whether a government is prepared to debate policy. And how ironic it is, Julia Gillard accusing us of breaking a deal, whereas before the election she promised the Australian people there would be no carbon tax. Now she says, do not serve on my committee unless you are prepared to accept a price on carbon, because I want to have either a carbon tax or an ETS.
On the question
It's Julia Gillard.
On the question of the price on carbon, going into the 2007 election, the Coalition wanted a market-based mechanism to deal with climate change. The Liberal Party inherently believes in free markets as opposed to government intervention. Why then, on climate change, have you changed your view that a carbon price is the most effective way to deal with the issue?
Well, our view was heavily influenced by Copenhagen, where there was meant to be a deal on global pricing of carbon, and the deal fell through. So Australia, to have a price on carbon now, would be ahead of most of the rest of the world,
but
to our great disadvantage.
I mean, look, I might be wrong, but I don't recall going into the 2007 election that your policy was contingent on what was to happen in Copenhagen several years later.
I think it was a very different environment, Lee, in 2007.
In what way?
Well, in 2007 there was a global consensus that was heading towards a price on carbon. What we saw out of Copenhagen was most of the rest of the world pulled away from having a price on carbon.
What makes you say there was a global consensus in 2007? Because most issues, when you look at it in the international community, there's always a schism between developed and developing countries, and I would suggest that climate change was no different.
No, there was a difference. I mean, quite clearly in 2007, the United States, having previously been opposed to a price on carbon, certainly looked as though it was heading towards that direction. There was an emissions trading scheme in Europe that was up and operating. I think there was a consensus view in Australia, and that consensus view has clearly changed.
Access Economics believes that Australia will only have 1 year in surplus before going back into deficit in 2013-14 as the resources boom fizzles out. It seems that a lot of Australia's economic eggs, if you like, are in that one basket. How does the Coalition think that the Australian economy can be cushioned against a slackening of demand for coal and iron ore?
Well, the best way to cushion our economy is to diversify our interests, not to take a baseball bat to our economy with higher interest rates, which will have a profound impact on consumer confidence. Importantly, if the government shows the commitment to undertake structural reform to get its budget back to surplus, then all Australians will be the beneficiaries of that. Particularly, it will take some of the upward pressure off interest rates. Having
said that, though, we're still heavily reliant on that one area. Are there things that can be done to, I guess, diversify our economy so that when the minerals boom inevitably ends, we will have a little bit of cushioning around that?
Well, I think we need to improve our productivity, and that's why we went to the election, seeking to improve productivity by getting more Australians, particularly under the age of 30 and particularly over the age of 50, who are on welfare into work. And that's why we went to the election with a commitment to reduce government expenditure. If we can reduce government expenditure, Lee, we can take some of the upward pressure off interest rates. And what we saw from Access Economics today was we heard a warning bell that the minerals boom is not going to continue to deliver the rivers of gold that the Treasury and the government expect. Therefore, we will not get the sustainable surplus budget so essential.
So if this current government nominated some areas in which they were going to reduce government expenditure, which sort of areas would you be prepared to support in the Parliament?
Well, we nominated a huge number of areas to reduce expenditure, such as not proceeding with the cash for clunkers deal, such as reducing the amount of support for the green car program. We also said, importantly, that the government needs to restructure some of its health spending. And significantly, we said that by having greater participation requirements in relation to welfare, that you'll actually have savings out of the welfare budget.
So presumably, if any of those things came up under the Gillard government, then they would have your blessing?
Yes.
During the election campaign, the Coalition nominated tax reform as a key priority, and as part of that, you want tax cuts. Given the economic forecast and the state of the global economy, when do you think would be the right time to introduce tax cuts?
Well, I think it needs to be part of an overall tax reform agenda, and we look forward, we'll be moving a motion in the Parliament soon for the full release of all of the costings and analysis of the Henry Review so that everyone can see everything relating to the full review of taxation, and we can have a properly informed debate about taxation in the lead up to the tax summit next year.
But you know what the forecasts are. You've advocated for tax cuts. When do you think would be the right time to introduce them, given the size of the deficit, I might add?
Well, you can't have significant tax cuts if the budget is in deficit. You can only hope to deliver them when you can actually get to the point of having a surplus and sustainable surplus that starts to pay off the Labor Party's debt.
Just one final question around the role of the coalition. Where do you think the line is in going from constructive opposition to being merely obstructionist?
Well, our responsibility is to make the Parliament work constructively, to hold the government to account, but also to present to the Australian people an alternative government that can do a better job than the current one. And we'll do that, Lee.
How will you know when you're crossing the line, though, is the question.
Well, the Australian people will tell us that.
Joe Hockey, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lee.